The sun didn't so much rise over the city as it did struggle through a thick veil of smog and exhaust, casting a sickly yellow light over the cracked pavement of the industrial district. For Elias, the morning light was never a promise, it was a deadline. He sat at his small kitchen table, the wood scarred by years of spilled coffee and late-night repairs, staring at the small white envelope that sat between him and his breakfast of dry toast. Inside that envelope was a number of debt that had grown legs and started to run faster than he could ever hope to chase it. His daughter, Clara, was still asleep in the next room. At 7 years old, her breath was the only thing in the world that sounded steady. Elias rubbed his eyes, the skin like thin parchment. He was 34, but the mirror told him he was 50. He worked 2 jobs, one at a local garage where the oil seemed to have seeped permanently into his pores, and a night shift at a shipping warehouse where the silence was often louder than the machinery. He remembered a time when the air didn't feel heavy. It was before the cough started in Clara's chest, before the specialist's office became their second home. He looked at the photo on the wall, his wife, Clara, laughing in a field of sunflowers. She had been the color in his grey world, but she had been gone for 3 years now, leaving him with a heart that felt like a hollowed-out tree and a daughter who looked exactly like her. Clara began to stir, her small frame appearing in the doorway. She was wearing a faded nightgown, her eyes bright despite the dark circles beneath them. She didn't complain about the cold in the apartment or the way the cereal was mostly dust at the bottom of the box. She simply walked over and hugged his waist, resting her head against his side. Elias felt a lump form in his throat, a jagged thing that threatened to break him open. He smoothed her hair, promising himself that he would find a way. He would always find a way. The day at the garage was grueling. The heat was oppressive, and the customers were impatient, their voices sharp and demanding. Elias worked in a haze, his mind constantly drifting back to the white envelope. Every bolt he tightened, every engine he tuned, he saw a fraction of a cent being shaved off the debt. By noon, his hands were trembling. His boss, a man named Miller whose face was a map of broken capillaries and cynicism, watched him from the office window. Miller wasn't a bad man, just a tight one. He called Elias in toward the end of the shift. He handed him a small bonus, a few crumpled bills that felt like a mockery of the mountain Elias had to climb. Elias thanked him, his voice a ghost of itself, and stepped back out into the sweltering afternoon. He had 4 hours before his night shift began. 4 hours to be a father, to pretend that the world wasn't closing in on them. He picked Clara up from the neighbor's apartment, and they walked to the park. It was a small, neglected patch of green surrounded by chain-link fences, but to Clara, it was a kingdom. She ran to the swings, her laughter ringing out like bells in a cathedral. Elias pushed her, watching her soar into the air. For those few moments, the debt disappeared. The illness was a myth. They were just a father and daughter in the sun. But as the shadows lengthened, the reality returned. Clara began to cough, a deep, rattling sound that made Elias's stomach knot. He pulled her close, wrapping his jacket around her small shoulders. He told her stories of the stars, of how they were the campfires of travelers in the sky. He told her that one day, they would go to a place where the air was sweet and the sunflowers grew as tall as houses. He tucked her into bed that night, his heart heavy with the weight of the lies he told to keep her brave. The night shift at the warehouse was a symphony of shadows. Elias moved through the aisles, his body acting on muscle memory alone. The crates were heavy, the air was stale, and the hours stretched out like a long, dark road. He thought about the envelope again. He thought about the way the doctor had looked at him with a mixture of pity and clinical detachment. There was a treatment, a possibility, but it was locked behind a door made of money he didn't have. He found himself standing in the back of the warehouse, near the high-value shipments. He knew the security routines. He knew where the cameras didn't reach. The thought crossed his mind like a dark bird. Just one crate. One crate could change everything. He looked at his hands, the grease beneath his nails, the scars of honest work. He thought of Sarah. He thought of the man she had loved. And then he thought of Clara, gasping for air in the middle of the night. He didn't do it. He couldn't. Instead, he worked harder, picking up extra shifts, selling the few heirlooms he had left, his wedding ring, Sarah's old watch, the small collection of books he had cherished since childhood. He became a shadow in his own life, a ghost haunted by the ticking of a clock he couldn't stop. Weeks turned into months. The debt didn't disappear, but it slowed its crawl. Clara seemed to stabilize, her laughter returning more frequently, though she was still fragile, like a glass bird. Then, on a Tuesday that felt like any other, Elias received a letter. It wasn't a bill. It wasn't a threat. It was a notification from the hospital. The debt had been paid in full. Not just the current bill, but the projected costs for the entire treatment. There was no name attached to the donation, only a short note, "For the girl who laughs like bells." Elias sat on his floor and wept. He wept for the months of terror, for the exhaustion that had nearly claimed him, for the miracle he couldn't explain. He took Clara to her next appointment, his head held high for the first time in years. The doctors were baffled but pleased. The treatment began, and slowly, the color returned to Clara's cheeks. She started to grow, to run without losing her breath. They finally moved out of the industrial district to a small house near park that actually had trees. Life became a series of quiet joys: fresh bread, long walks, and the absence of the white envelope. Elias never stopped wondering who had saved them. He thought of Miller, but the man had barely enough to keep the garage running. He thought of the knaves, but they were all drowning in the same sea he had been. The mystery remained a quiet hum in the background of their new, bright life. 10 years passed. Clara was a young woman now, preparing to leave for university. She was brilliant, kind, and full of the life Elias had fought so hard to preserve. On the night before she left, they sat on their small porch, watching the stars. Elias, now gray-haired and peaceful, finally told her about the mystery donor. He spoke of the dark times, of the warehouse, and of the letter that changed everything. Clara listened in silence, her eyes reflecting the starlight. When he finished, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. It was Sarah's. Elias hadn't seen it since the day she died. Clara opened it to the last page, where a small, yellowed newspaper clipping was tucked away. It was an obituary for a wealthy man Elias had never met, a philanthropist who had died the same week the debt was paid. But pasted next to it was a small, hand-drawn map of the warehouse where Elias had worked. Clara looked at her father, her voice a soft whisper. Mom knew, Dad. Before she got sick, she worked as a bookkeeper for that man's estate. She saw the way you worked, the way you sacrificed everything. She set it up. She didn't have the money then, but she made sure that if anything ever happened to her, there was a fund, a secret trust for the family at the hardest worker avenue. She didn't tell you because she wanted you to keep fighting, to keep being the man she loved. She knew your strength was the only thing that would keep me safe until the fund matured. Elias